you've used meal logging apps, you've had that thought. Ugh, especially if you cook at home. So, why AI instead of a standard app? Well, no prompts to record everything daily. You get to use it when you want without prompts that force you to engage more or that make you record everything when you really don't need to sometimes. If you're eating oatmeal every day, you got this. Easy to turn off unsolicited advice. You get to use it how you want. Ask it to remember your preferences and tone. Able to record and remember recipes measured however you want. Just dump in everything you know, metric or imperial, structured like a recipe or in a conversational ramble. It will figure it out. Ask questions and get suggestions. What can I substitute? What portions work best? How can I add protein or fiber to this? How do I cook that? When I started making breads, I asked lots of questions about yeast and kneading, such as, well, it looks like this, it feels like this. Is that right? I made enchiladas and I found thickening options for the sauce so that I could skip the roux. I ended up using pureed white beans. It worked perfect. To give you an example of how it might work to use AI, we need to start with targets. I did this for a client, and I'm shielding the actual prompt to keep details private. ChatGTP started with the equation to determine caloric intake after I included age, gender, height, current weight, desired weight, a description of current activity level to include weekly exercise and approximate step count, as well as the goal. I didn't specify how I wanted calories calculated to see what method AI would use, because there's a lot of bad information on the internet. So, why this equation? The National Academy of Sports Medicine goes into detail about this and other equations, noting that this is probably the best guess, while also noting its shortcomings. If you're using an estimate such as this, you'll also want to listen to your body. We're not just going to use this, we're going to look at the calories that he consumes. We're going to try to get to a place where he's kind of hitting these targets and then tweak accordingly based on his hunger and satiety. You'll notice that it went for a modest deficit right here, right? And the goal is 1900 to 2100 calories per day. All right. And then macronutrient distribution supportive of type 2 diabetes management. It says evidence supports higher protein, moderate carbohydrate, and emphasis on low glycemic whole food sources. Okay, that's pretty standard. You know, again, we're talking about what might work for the average person. For exact measures, he would need to go to a dietitian. I am not a dietitian. Okay. So these tools are available to use at your own risk. This is probably a pretty solid target. But again, a nutritionist or a dietitian could give you exact information. So we're looking at a protein percentage, right? Or total calories, 25 to 30%. And then carbohydrates, we've got 35 to 40%. And then fats, 30 to 35%. All right. It does say to keep saturated fat modest and to prioritize mono and polyunsaturated fats. Okay, and give some examples. And then it included this practical structure. It said protein anchor at each meal. Yeah, that's a pretty sound piece of advice. Make sure to start by anchoring your meal with your protein and adding from there. It's the easiest way to design a meal. Carbohydrate distributed evenly across meals, snacks to avoid large excursions. That's pretty right on, right? Include a fiber target of at least 30 grams a day. That's great for blood sugar management And it's great that they included this piece of information. Align higher carbohydrate meals near exercise sessions to improve glycemic response. Also, pretty solid advice. And then I asked ChatGPT, can you break down the target calories and macros to what each meal should be? Now, I was just being lazy because generally I might say cut it in thirds. A third of your calories for breakfast, a third of your calories for lunch, a third of your calories for dinner, right? That's just the easiest way to do it. But I was surprised at the response and I followed it up because what ChatGPT recommended is 500 calories here for breakfast, 600 calories for lunch, and 700 calories for dinner. And I was curious why it naturally broke there, right? So I said, what is the rationale of increasing calories from 500 to 700 per meal rather than an equally distributed meal? Why was it just not a third, a third, a third? And it gave me a thorough answer. It said a step structure aligns with typical circadian patterns, glycemic control, and behavioral adherence rather than nutrition math alone. Now, it says appetite and satiety typically rise later in the day. True. All right. Evening is when most calories are naturally consumed. That is also true. Glycemic control can still be maintained. Now, let's dig into that a little deeper. Even though insulin sensitivity is generally higher earlier in the day, moderate carbohydrate intake spread across meals limits glucose excursions. The difference between 500 and 700 kcals doesn't meaningfully change glycemic patterns if protein and fiber are consistent. Okay, there we go. And then we have strength training performance is often better so is often better supported with more evening calories. Behaviorally, it reduces energy drift. Okay, so that's huge. If all meals are set at 650 kcals, many people end up under eating breakfast and overeating dinner. The step pattern keeps intake predictable without requiring perfect behavior. It's still flexible. So it does recognize, of course, that people's eating patterns are different. Some people will eat their largest meal at lunch, and that makes a lot of sense. Or some people will have a small amount of food at breakfast and a mid morning snack. So if my client tends to eat oatmeal and cottage cheese for breakfast, can you give me some proportions that might approximate that breakfast breakdown? And feel free to suggest complementary foods that could get us closer to that target. I really wanted to see what it would say about how to do that accurately. And this is stuff that you can figure out on your own, but I wanted to see how much it could do the heavy lifting for you if you were going to ask it these kind of questions. And for oatmeal, it recommended half a cup of dry old fashioned oats. All right. And then the cottage cheese was 3/4 cup. And I knew that was going to be low in calories, right? So that's 310 calories. That's not near the 500 that we were aiming for. And then the protein was 25 grams, carbs 33, fat 7 to 8 grams. And the suggested add ons were nuts and seeds. All right. So 1 tablespoon of walnuts or almonds. Okay. A low glycemic fruit. So half a cup of berries. And then 1 teaspoon of chia seeds. It adds some fiber. Okay. So that brought us to 480 to 520 calories. Protein is 30 to 32 grams, carbs 43 to 47, and fat 18 to 20. So that hits that target really closely. And what it says for this mix of slow digesting oats, high protein from cottage cheese, fiber from berries and chia, and healthy fats from nuts produces a steady glucose response. If glucose runs higher in the morning, reduce oats to 1/3 cup and increase cottage cheese to a full cup. Okay, So it's giving really thorough information and guidance to someone who, would find themselves really having to juggle and create a formula and figure out the math to this stuff. And it makes it easy to change meals later on, because you have a baseline that you can say, "Hey, I usually eat this. How can I add this?" Or you might say, "I want to replace the cottage cheese. What is something that works better?" Or, "I'm tired of oatmeal. How can I jazz it up?" There's a lot of different things that you can do. Remember, though, that as you create this, as you're building your own meal planner, to tell ChatGPT what it is that you want it to remember. I did an additional query to find restaurants within walking distance from work. I asked for 3 options that fit his calorie and macro needs. Now, for his privacy, I've done the same thing using a fictitious address in the Capitol Hill area of Seattle. You'll see that these are the 3 meals: Market Grill, Sweet Green, Momiji. Now, it gives these 3 options, the location, and some information about how to tailor the specific orders to get more closely to that criteria that we were looking for. This is a way to get you thinking. There's plenty of other areas or foods that you can have for lunch. It just gives you an idea of where to start if you feel like it's a lot starting out. And then you can work your way out from there. But having those, maybe those are plan B options, because they will be usually chain restaurant choices, because those are the facilities that post their menus and are accessible to ChatGPT. But this gives you a place to start. It never has to be, ugh, log or don't log. You can use more flexible tools to fill in information gaps without a full time commitment.